On the morning of August 15, 2025, the world awoke to a political and economic thunderclap that few had anticipated. It did not come from Washington or from Brussels or from the gilded boardrooms of London and New York. It came from Beijing, where far from the traditional centers of Western power, a small, landlocked nation often ignored on world maps signed an agreement that would ripple across continents. Burkina Faso, with a GDP scarcely above $20 billion, placed its signature on a trade deal worth $2.1 billion. At first glance, many dismissed it as another contract. Yet for those who looked deeper, it was something far larger. It was a declaration, a manifesto, a moment where dignity and sovereignty spoke louder than balance sheets. For decades, Western capitals maintained their grip on Africa through familiar instruments, aid packages that came with suffocating conditions, debt programs that chained governments to repayment schedules longer than a generation, and mining concessions that drained the continent of its gold, its copper, its cotton, and its oil. The cycle was predictable: loans tied to austerity, exports tied to external markets, resources tied to extraction. Africa in this script was not an equal partner. It was a supplier, a dependency, a subject. But on that August morning, the script cracked. Burkina Faso, once described by analysts as peripheral, dared to challenge the architecture of dependency. A single agreement, valued at more than 10% of the country's economy, was not signed in Paris or Washington. It was negotiated in Beijing, outside the orbit of Western oversight. The symbolism was undeniable. It was not about gold or cotton alone. It was about dignity. It was about standing before the world and declaring that sovereignty is measured not by geography, but by courage. Consider the scale. A nation with a GDP dwarfed by European economies put pen to paper on terms it had never been offered before. All tariffs on Burkina Faso exports to China were abolished. Cotton, gold, livestock, shea butter, and agricultural produce would flow into one of the world's largest markets tariff-free. Analysts projected that this could raise annual exports by more than 200 million within 2 years, a dramatic leap for a nation whose total exports barely exceeded $3.5 billion at the time. In addition, Beijing guaranteed $1 billion in trade volume within 5 years. Compare that to decades of lopsided agreements where Africa's share of benefits rarely touched double digits. For many, it was not just a contract, it was a tectonic shift. The financing terms alone shocked observers. While IMF and World Bank loans had historically imposed interest rates of 8 to 12%, often tied to deep spending cuts in schools and hospitals, China offered loans at just 2%. For a country where debt service already consumed 15% of government revenue, the difference was life-changing. Instead of choosing between teachers and medicine, Burkina Faso could now channel funds into energy grids, industrial parks, and regional transport corridors. Beijing earmarked $800 million specifically for infrastructure, power plants, and training programs. Even more significant, the deal prioritized technology transfer and workforce development, inviting Burkina Faso not merely to extract resources, but to process, refine, and climb the value chain. Yet symbolism carried even more weight than economics. Across the Sahel, young people, farmers, and intellectuals read the deal as a new declaration of independence. It was a rejection of an old order defined by extraction and dependency. By signing in Beijing rather than Brussels or Washington, President Ibrahim Traoré signaled to the world, Africa has choices, and choice itself is power. But the road to this moment was not smooth. The breaking point had arrived not in Ouagadougou, but in Washington. Only weeks before, the United States had imposed a 50% tariff on shea butter, Burkina Faso's signature export, and the livelihood of thousands of women's cooperatives. Overnight, a $200 million industry collapsed. To Washington, the intent was clear: weaken the economy, pressure the government, remind Ouagadougou where power truly sat. But instead of bending, Burkina Faso broke free. Within 72 hours, Traoré countered with the Beijing Pact, turning the sanction into a strategic weapon. Under the agreement, China pledged to absorb Burkina Faso's shea exports at preferential rates, guaranteeing markets that Washington thought it had shut down. A product targeted for economic suffocation became the very bridge that opened Africa's second-largest deal of the decade. Women's cooperatives in Bobo-Dioulasso celebrated in the streets. Students marched in Ouagadougou. Commentators across Africa spoke of shea not as a commodity, but as a banner of sovereignty. The ink on the deal had barely dried before its consequences spread. Inside Burkina Faso, the shift was immediate. Gold refining capacity expanded. Shea butter exports doubled. Cooperatives once selling raw nuts for pennies now linked directly to processing plants built with Chinese financing. Household incomes rose by more than 35% within a year. Data from the Finance Ministry projected a GDP growth rate of nearly 8% for 2026, compared to 3% 2 years earlier. For the first time in decades, schools and hospitals received funding not from loans, but from new trade revenue. But the transformation did not stop at the borders. Inspired by Ouagadougou's defiance, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea followed with their own agreements, collectively worth over $12 billion. The Sahel, once seen as fragile and dependent, now spoke with a new voice. The African Economic Sovereignty Bloc, once dismissed as symbolic, looked increasingly like a rising counterweight. Social media exploded with hashtags, #Africa for Africans, #New Deal for the Sahel. Pride became policy. The West, however, reacted with unease. Washington blacklisted Burkinabe officials, froze assets, and restricted financial channels. Brussels followed, branding the deal reckless. The IMF and World Bank warned of looming debt traps, despite their own rates being 4 to 6 times higher than Beijing's. Western militaries staged joint exercises near Burkina Faso's borders, flexing muscles to remind the Sahel of who once policed the region. At the same time, Western media flooded the airwaves with narratives of Chinese neocolonialism. Civil society groups, many tied to Western NGOs, staged protests calling the deal a sellout. The paradox was plain. When Africa aligns with the West, it is called partnership. When Africa aligns elsewhere, it is suddenly called dependency. China anticipated the backlash. Beijing offered protections, transactions conducted in renminbi instead of dollars, insurance through Chinese-backed firms, and port access through Djibouti. For Burkina Faso, this was more than trade. It was a shield. For the first time, an African nation did not merely endure sanctions, but transformed them into an engine of diversification. Yet shadows lurked. Inflation rose as demand for local goods soared. Critics worried about dependence on a single partner. Civil servants whispered of assassination plots and covert destabilization. Social media buzzed with rumors of mercenaries at the border. Traoré himself declared, "If my life is the price of freedom, so be it. But our nation will never again bow to ultimatums." His words electrified supporters but deepened the sense of danger. Still, the cultural transformation was undeniable. Across Burkina Faso, hip-hop artists, poets, and painters celebrated the trade pact. T-shirts printed with slogans like "Sanctions equal sovereignty" sold in markets. Youth flooded TikTok with memes mocking Western penalties, treating them as medals of honor. Universities held debates on whether sanctions were the new form of colonial conquest. Farmers said, "They sanction us because they fear us. They fear we are no longer begging." The headlines in Paris called it reckless. In Washington, it was called naive. In Addis Ababa, it was hailed as continental awakening. At the African Union, leaders praised it as a step toward Agenda 2063, a blueprint for sovereignty and prosperity. Some in ECOWAS hesitated, fearing dependence on Beijing, but the momentum was unmistakable. France, once the undisputed power in Francophone Africa, found itself sidelined. European contracts worth billions evaporated within months as African leaders reconsidered their options. For the youth of Burkina Faso, the horizon shifted. For decades, ambition meant Europe. Dangerous journeys across the Sahara and Mediterranean were the path to opportunity. But with scholarships to Beijing, Shenzhen, and Shanghai, With incubators in Ouagadougou backed by Chinese firms, with jobs rising in logistics and energy, the future pointed east. The world had to take notice. From New York to Tokyo, analysts debated whether this was the dawn of a multipolar order or merely a new dependency under another flag. Was this a sustainable assertion of sovereignty or a fragile gamble that would invite destabilization? Could a small landlocked nation, once dismissed as peripheral, carry the weight of such defiance? History teaches us that every declaration of dignity invites resistance. Sanctions may tighten, covert plots may deepen, inflation may bite. But what is undeniable is that Burkina Faso forced itself into the global conversation. It reminded the world that sovereignty is not measured by size or GDP, but by courage. And so the question now is not whether the $2.1 billion trade pact will change Burkina Faso. It already has. The real question is whether the world is ready for an Africa that negotiates on equal terms.